Very good. Well, welcome everyone to our fourth session. I can't believe it's already our fourth session of our Lincoln Memorial 100 series. Very excited to have you join us today. And we're able to do this series at all thanks to our partner, the Trust for the National Mall. So I am going to pass it to Edward for a quick welcome and hello from the Trust for the National Mall. Edward.
Well, thanks so much, Jen, and welcome everyone. So I'm Edward. I'm the Director of Public Engagement Programs at the Trust for the National Mall. We're a nonprofit partner of the Park Service here in the mall, and we've been absolutely thrilled to help Ranger Jen put together this series of teacher workshops, moving towards the 100-year anniversary of the Lincoln Memorial in May. The memorial, as you've seen, is a national treasure. The legacies embedded in it don't just rest in the stone, but stretch across the country. We're happy today to welcome Ranger Stacy Humphries from the Abraham Lincoln Birthplace National Historic Park in Kentucky. You can see previous virtual youth education programs, including a presentation on Marian Anderson's historic concert on the steps of the Lincoln, along with several other teacher workshops on our website, nationalmall.org, under the Explore tab. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you in our future sessions. So Jen, back to you.
Thank you, Edward, and thank you, Erin, for helping us to organize these sessions and host them. It's been great for us to share with teachers who have been able to participate about different stories related to the Lincoln Memorial. And today we have Ranger Stacy joining us from Kentucky. Ranger Stacy used to work with us on the National Mall a long time ago, maybe not that many longs ago, but a little bit ago. And I'm very excited to have her join us today and tell us about her park, the Lincoln Birthplace, Abraham Lincoln Birthplace Memorial. I'll let you correctly introduce your site. Thank you for being here, Stacy.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you, Edward and Erin and everyone for joining me today. I really appreciate it. And yes, I'm joining you from the Abraham Lincoln Birthplace National Historical Park. We're located in beautiful Hodgenville, Kentucky. We're located just south of Lexington and just north of Mammoth Cave. So if anyone knows where that is, some landmarks here in Kentucky. Louisville, of course, is famous for the running of the Kentucky Derby every year, but I'll show a map here as part of my presentation. And if you have questions, love questions, so please pop them in the chat. Jen is going to read them to me throughout, and I'm going to also leave some time at the end for questions as well. So I'm going to go ahead and start by sharing my screen with everyone. And Jen, if you could please tell me when you all see my screen, that would be awesome. Can you see it? It says—
There it is. Yes. Excellent.
Okay, so this is what I like to call the money shot of my park. We see it over here over my shoulder as well, but this is our memorial building, the Lincoln Memorial. And as I've made a point and to put throughout the program, we actually my park is home to the first national monument to Abraham Lincoln in our country. So our memorial was built, the Cornerstone was laid in 1909, and it was completed and done in 1911. So about 11 years or so before the completion of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. So I'll dive into that a little bit later on in the program. I've given Jen my slide deck. So if anyone would like to have that, just you can email me or you can email Jen, and I'd be happy to share it with you. This is all of my contact information. You can reach me office, park cell, as well as government email with nps.gov at the end. And I also, again, like I said, I'm going to try to draw as many connections with the Lincoln Memorial. Since we know, this grand memorial is turning 100 years old this year. And I used to work on the National Mall as well at the beginning of my career, as Jen said. So I have a lot of fond memories of this memorial, and just standing in the chamber and looking up at Mr. Lincoln and reading the words of the Gettysburg Address that are etched in the side, Just pondering everything that happened at this monument, how it's just become a touchstone that's really a part of our national psyche, of who we are. I mean, we carry this around in our pocket every day on our pennies and on our $5 bills. So this memorial and Lincoln looms large for everyone who is American and even our international visitors. It's always amazing to me that, even here in little Hodgenville, Kentucky, population 3,000, we get a lot of visitors from all over the world that are drawn here, like they're drawn to the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., to come and stand and bask in the shadow of Lincoln and ponder the man and ponder what he did and what he did for our country. And it just speaks to the power of who he is and what power these monuments hold in the place in our collective psyche as to who we are. So this program that I designed and I'm sharing with you all today are aligned with our Kentucky education standards here in the state. I've designed this program specifically for grades 1 through 4, but it can be altered and used for other grades as well. But today, this is specifically being done for our elementary school kids, our younglings. So,
hey, Stacy, I have a question already.
Yes, please do.
Don't mind me interrupting. Do you have it in your plan to talk about Theodore Roosevelt's visit to the birthplace?
Yes, I do. Absolutely.
Okay, well, then we'll hold off on that, but I asked your question. Hold tight, it's coming.
Thank you. And we like to say 5 presidents and a first lady came to our site here in Kentucky. So I will be touching on Teddy's visit. So today, my my saying I like to use on a lot of my programs is a quote by Aristotle: "Give me a child until he is 7, and I will show you the man." And that is very telling. Our young years, our formative years, have a great impact on us, even us today. But Lincoln lived the first 7 years of his life here in the state of Kentucky. And those Kentucky roots go deep. I often like to say those seeds that were planted here in Kentucky would grow and bear fruit in him as a young man. And then later on, of course, as president, we would still see these threads kind of weaving throughout his life, some of those early teachings and early experiences that were embedded so in his psyche and in his person. You can trace back a lot of it here to Kentucky. This is a map of where our park is located. We're at the very annoyingly large red dot that says Abraham Lincoln Birthplace National Monument, just south of Louisville. And then if you can look south, you see Bowling Green, Cave City, Glasgow. By Cave City, that green patch is where Mammoth Cave is located. And my park is made up of 2 units. There is the Birthplace Unit, which this is a map of the Birthplace Unit, which is home to our memorial building, which I'll be talking a lot about during this program. We also have a traditional visitor center that was built in the late 1950s that is located there. We have some walking trails, picnic area, usually a lot of stuff that you would traditionally find at a national park. And then 10 miles from the Birthplace Unit is the Boyhood Home Unit at Knob Creek. So I have 2 units in the park, but they're separated by 10 miles and we're just under 400 acres total. So we're a bit of a smaller park, but it's a very powerful story. And it's an interesting story because we get to kind of challenge a lot of people's expectations about Lincoln. Lincoln always, when you say Abraham Lincoln, people always think, oh, that's the president. But we like to challenge that notion and say, yeah, but Lincoln, he had experiences as a boy, as a very young man here on the Kentucky frontier. So it's a unique opportunity to talk about those years that not many people readily think of when they think of Abraham Lincoln. So a lot of kids ask me, and adults, how did the Lincoln family get here to Kentucky? And throughout this presentation, I have woven in and out some activities that you can do with your kids to kind of drive some points home. And so I've picked out some of the better ones that I've liked, that have worked for me in the past, that I'm going to be sharing with you all. So those are kind of scattered throughout the program. But the Lincoln family came through the Cumberland Gap. Cumberland Gap is also another national park, so shout out to them. But it's where, as you can see from the map, where Kentucky, Virginia, and Tennessee come together. And a lot of people who were exploring or pushing into Western territories. And these were happening in the 1700s. A lot of people came through the Cumberland Gap from Virginia into Kentucky, and that's how they got into what was known as the West at that time. So a lot of people came through the Cumberland Gap, including the Lincoln family. Abraham Lincoln the Elder, as I like to call him, which was Abraham Lincoln, our 16th president's grandfather, who he was named after, came through the Cumberland Gap with people from the likes of Daniel Boone. So here's a picture of Daniel Boone leading some of those pioneers through the Cumberland Gap. And one of the questions I like kids to think about is these terms that we use. What's the difference between a pioneer and a frontiersman? Or what's the difference between the pioneer era or the frontier? So you can go a lot about different ways in introducing these terms. You can have them write a definition, you can have them shout it out, you could do a word scatter where you give them an index card and they can write out what they think it is and lay those out on the ground and have everybody explore what those, read everybody else's. So this is a good question to ask because I like to set this up. The pioneers were people who came into an area that were unsettled by white settlers, that were trying to find a place to live further into the West. The frontiersmen were individuals who had come after the pioneer era. The land had already been settled and they were also seeking a place to live. But a lot of times either land had been settled or been cleared previously. By the time we get to the frontier era, which is where Lincoln lived Abraham Lincoln, our 16th president, lived in Kentucky. Now, Abraham Lincoln, the elder, the grandfather of our 16th president, very tragic story with him. He did come, like I said, he did come through. He was a pioneer. He settled in Kentucky and he had 3 sons, one of which was named Thomas. And Thomas would grow up and become Abraham Lincoln's, our president's father. But when Thomas was a very, very young man, his father, Abraham Lincoln the Elder, they were working on the farm one day and there was a band of Native Americans that came through and shots were exchanged and words were exchanged and Abraham Lincoln the Elder was actually killed. So this, I'm sure, marked Thomas and he remembered this probably for the rest of his life. But in those days, even though Abraham Lincoln the Elder had 3 sons, all of his possessions would pass to the eldest son, which was a man by the name of Mordecai, was his eldest. So he got the family home. And this is where Mordecai would go on to live for the rest of his life. And unfortunately, Thomas got nothing. So Thomas, our 16th president's father, he had to set out and kind of eke out his own existence. So he became a couple things. He became a woodworker. He was very well known as his cabinet making abilities and woodworking abilities. He also collected tolls and taxes. He also did a little bit of land surveying here and there. So he kind of became this jack of all trades, and he was also a farmer. Thomas did love working the land. He loved to work with his hands. That's where he found the most joy in life. So this is a photograph of Thomas Lincoln. And when I show this to students, I always tell them, now this was taken when Thomas was in his late 50s. And this is not how he would have looked when he moved to the Sinking Spring Farm. He was in his early 30s when they moved. So Thomas, because he had to kind of find his own way in the world, he moved to from Springfield, Kentucky to nearby Elizabethtown, which is about 20 miles from Hodgenville, which is where Sinking Spring Farm is. Thomas Lincoln would go on to purchase Sinking Spring Farm. He would spend $300 for 200 acres of land, which is pretty good. I wish we could get a deal like that nowadays, but he did spend quite a bit of money. And this might have been an inheritance. We're not really sure where all of that money came from, but he did spend honest, good money for that farm. That's a very important fact to remember because that's going to factor into our story a little bit later. But as you're imagining Thomas Lincoln, Abraham's father, you have to imagine him as a younger man than what you see in this photograph. Unfortunately, this is the only known photograph we have of Thomas, so that's why I share it. Now, Lincoln, our president's mother, was a lady named Nancy Hanks Lincoln. And we don't have a photograph of Nancy. This painting that I'm showing here is actually an artist conception of Nancy. Basically, An artist did some research and took contemporary descriptions of Nancy, of people describing her looks, her height, her features, and they came up with this painting. A lot of people, we have this hanging in our visitor center. A lot of people come in to look at it and they're like, Abraham looks a lot like her. And I'm like, well, they did take features, especially these very large hands that you see on her in this painting. So this is what we think his mom may have looked like, but again, it's not a photograph, so we don't know that for sure. So when the Lincolns settled at Sinking Spring Farm, which is what we call the Birthplace Unit today, it was land that would have been semi-cleared, similar to what the photograph that you see here. So you would have had patches of land, again, on the frontier, this was common. You would have had patches of land that would have been open, and then there would have been patches of land that would have been forested. So the Lincolns would have had to work very hard to clear the land in order to plant. So again, something to think about when the Lincolns settled here, they not only had to build their home, but they also had to clear the land in order to start farming it so they could live, basically. So it was a lot of hard work, but a lot of people, like Thomas, took a lot of satisfaction in doing work like this. So this is a photograph, an old photo of our cabin. This is a symbolic birth cabin. And this is very typical of what a Kentucky frontier cabin would have looked like. Typical Kentucky frontier cabin was 16 feet by 20 feet in size. It would have had one room, one chimney, one fireplace, and one doorway. Now, I always tell people, you know how we do improvements on our homes today. You would have started out with a dirt floor, but if you lived there long enough, then you would improve upon it and create a wooden floor a little bit later on. A lot of times too, frontier folk would install a loft area above the main room, and that's where they would have had storage, but also where the younger kids of the family would have slept. And this is where Thomas and his sister Sarah would have slept when they became toddlers. So another question I like to ask students is, living in this frontier cabin, again, very different than what we live in today. You know, imagine taking everything in your room, everything in your house that you live in today, and what would you bring with you? What would you try to fit in that 16 by 20 foot space that you needed for everything to live? So you get a lot of really great answers for this. Some kids say, you know, I'm going to bring my gaming console. And I'm like, that's cool, but where are you going to plug it in? You know, so you got to think about things like that. So it challenges kids to kind of think outside of their own time period, kind of putting themselves in the shoes of a frontier individual. And again, just an artist rendering of the cabin at Sinking Spring Farm. We do know Lincoln quoted and said he was born on the rise on the hill above Sinking Spring. So that's why the Lincoln Farm Association, which I'll talk about in a moment, chose to put the Lincoln Memorial, first Lincoln Memorial, the memorial building on top of the hill above the Sinking Spring. So this is an artist rendering of that early cabin. And this is our Sinking Spring. This was very important. And I take all the students and all of our visitors that come to Sinking Spring Farm at the Birthplace Unit down to Sinking Spring. Sinking Spring was the freshwater supply for the farm, and it is a spring that runs still year round. It never freezes. And this is very, very important because you had to have a freshwater supply in order to survive. So this is one of the main benefits of this farm, is that this was already in existence. The Sinking Spring is very interesting as well, because you can also get into kind of the geology features of our region in Kentucky. We have a lot of caves. We have a lot of limestone in this area. So what you're looking at here are actually two layers of a cave. You're seeing a top layer, and then where the hole has formed and the water is dripping down, you're seeing the lower layer of the cave. And when you come and visit me, hopefully Jen, sometime this summer, you sometimes see frogs. There's sometimes crayfish that still live in the Sinking Spring. I like to tell people this is where Abraham Lincoln got his first drinks of water from. It is also caves, so it's cooler. And you can really notice that in the summertime, as you walk down the steps to the sinking spring, the temperature drops about 10 to 12 degrees. So they probably not only use this as their fresh water supply, but also for refrigeration. So again, challenge the kids. What do you think you would like if you couldn't just go to the refrigerator and pick something out? You had to come down the hill and get it out of the spring or gather water at the spring for things like cooking or bathing. I mean, it's something not that we take for granted. We turn on a light switch or we turn on a faucet and we think and just assume electricity or water is always going to be there. Not so much on the Kentucky frontier. This is a depiction talking about the karst landscape here in Kentucky, and it talks about how caves and sinking springs can be formed through the movement of water through the limestone, because limestone is very porous, so it allows the water to flow. Sometimes I do an activity with kids that is called the sugar cube cave activity, and this one is always very popular. It's really simple. It's basically you take sugar cubes, an eyedropper, and a glass of water. That's all you need, something very simple. And basically you line up the sugar cubes, or you have kids put their sugar cubes in their own little formation that you want to. Then we say, okay, we're gonna take the water in our eyedropper and drop it on the sugar cubes. Pardon me. The sugar cubes are gonna be our limestone. And as we see that water being dropped onto our limestone sugar cubes, you'll see how the water dissolves and creates little tunnels and passages through the sugar cubes. And that's exactly how caves are formed. So it's a really simple activity to do that's very easy. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. That's very easy to set up, and kids and adults seem to enjoy it, but it gets the point across on how caves are formed. All right. So Lincoln was born at the Sinking Spring Farm, February 12th, 1809. The Lincoln family lived there at the Sinking Spring for 2 years. At the age of 2, Thomas Lincoln, his father, remember I said he paid good money for that farm? Unfortunately, land surveys in Kentucky during the frontier time were not backed by the federal government. So basically more than one person could go out and do their own survey, and more than one person could claim the same piece of property. And unfortunately, that's what happened to Thomas Lincoln. 3 other people claimed Sinking Spring Farm as their own. So Thomas tried to fight this in courts, and he actually brought a court case, and it would be heard, but it was very long and very frustrating for Thomas. So at one point, excuse me a second. Oh, I'm sorry. He decides to move his family 10 miles from the Sinking Spring Farm to the Boyhood Home Unit at Knob Creek, or what was then known as the Knob Creek Farm. So rather than staying at Sinking Spring, because there are people coming knocking on his door, yelling at him, saying, get off my land, where he had paid for it, he moved his family away. This is the Symbolic Boyhood Home Cabin at Knob Creek. So when the Lincoln family moved here, when Abraham was only 2 years old, they decided to lease the land. They leased about 30 acres of what they called fertile bottom soil, excellent for farming. But it was important that they did not buy it. One, we think Thomas didn't have the money to do so because he had paid that money for Sinking Spring Farm in good faith, thinking he was going to own it. So they just leased it to try to let that court case be settled. So from the time Lincoln was 2 till he was 7, the family lived at Knob Creek Farm. So for 5 years. And during these 5 years, Lincoln's going to have a lot of formative experiences. He does have memories of the Knob Creek Farm that he talks about later in life. He talks about different things, seeing different things, meeting different people. So this is a really neat place. This is also where Lincoln is going to get his first or only 1.5 years of formal schooling. Him and his sister, Sarah, attend a blab school, which was about 1.5 miles down the road from their cabin here at Knob Creek Farm. And they lived right along the turnpike. In this artwork, you can see that we actually had commissioned for our Knob Creek exhibits, which are new. You could see him peeking out the cabin door, looking at the main highway. And I always tell kids, you know, this road that runs in front of the site today, that was like the main interstate of the day. So he would have seen travelers, he would have seen people from all walks of life. He also quite possibly could have seen African-American slaves being walked down this road, taken to Deep South slave markets. So that would have had an effect on him. We know after the War of 1812, Lincoln encountered soldiers coming home from the war. And he talked about one day he was fishing and he caught a fish, which he was very proud of, but the soldiers came by and one started talking to him and said he was very hungry. So Lincoln gave the soldier his fish because he said his parents always told him he needed to be nice to soldiers, which that would also stick with him for the rest of his life. This is also another artwork piece that we have commissioned. Not many people know, while the family lived at Knob Creek, Lincoln had a baby brother that was born and died as an infant. Now, unfortunately, we don't know what that means. The historical record is fuzzy. As an infant, that could be anywhere from the baby living for a few hours or a few days up to a year old. So when the baby was born and tragically passed, the family, again, because they leased the farm, they didn't own the land, they asked the neighbors nearby, the Redmond family, if they could bury the baby on their property. And the family agreed. So this is an artist's conception of Thomas Lincoln, the gentleman in kind of the gray pants with the stone marked TL. We do have this stone in our collection. It is on display in the winter at the Birthplace Unit. And then in the summer when Knob Creek Visitor Center is open, it's in display out there. We think the baby was named Thomas, but we don't know that for sure since Abraham was named after his grandfather. It only stands to reason that the second born son would be named after the father. And it also shows Nancy standing in the blue dress, Sarah in the yellow dress with her arm around young Abraham. So this is really the first time Abraham is going to experience loss on a large scale. This is also a theme that we would see throughout Abraham Lincoln's life as well, with the loss of his mother, his birth mother, the loss of his sister, the loss of sons later in life. And then this is a photo of Knob Creek itself. If you come visit me, we can take you down. I can take you down and we can walk along the bank. It doesn't look like it in this picture, but when it rains, all the rains from the knobs, the hills on each side run down into the creek, and the creek can actually rise. I've seen it as high as almost 5 feet tall, 6 feet in height, and it's almost like rapids. And this goes back to, again, another story that a friend of Lincoln said, Austin Gallagher, that one day as kids, him and Lincoln were playing by the creek, a big storm blew up, and the creek turned into a raging torrent, and Lincoln toppled in. So thankfully, Austin was there, and he said he extended a branch, and Lincoln crawled out almost half dead, as he said, which is very heroic sounding. But I always ask kids, what do you think our history would be like if Austin Gallagher had not been there that day? I'm sure we would have had a very interesting and different history. So this is a quote. I like using quotes and pictures a lot with kids to think about. Lincoln said later in life, he actually wrote a letter in 1864 that says, I am naturally anti-slavery. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel. It's interesting to note that Abraham Lincoln's parents, Nancy and Thomas, were both anti-slavery in their leanings, which is interesting. Their neighbors, the Gallaghers, whose Lincoln was friends with, they owned slaves. So even though they had slaveholding neighbors, the Lincoln family were anti-slavery in their leanings. We also know that when the family lived at Knob Creek, they attended Little Mount Baptist Church, which was an anti-slavery Baptist church in those days. So not only did Lincoln hear anti-slavery teachings at home, he would hear those from the pulpit on Sunday mornings as well. So again, things that would stick with him throughout his life. Okay, and another activity I do with kids, just examining those quotes. You can examine the quote that I just showed you. And also Abraham Lincoln said, my earliest recollection is of the Knob Creek place, which is the Knob Creek, the second home that they lived in. So some of the questions I like to ask the kids, what are some of your earliest childhood memories? What do you remember from your childhood? And how do you think these experiences shaped the person that you are? So you can do this as a quiet activity. I mean, some kids like to talk. I was always one that liked to talk in class. I know, big surprise. But some are more, some kids don't like to, some like to think. So you can do this as a quiet, a reflection activity. You could have some kids share that want to share. Again, you could do a word scatter, like pass out index cards, and have kids write their thoughts on this. And then they could pass it to a friend, or they could, we put it in a big hat and have people draw ones out and read them and share with the group. So you can approach this from different ways, just to kind of get thoughts about like how the earliest experiences of their lives affected them, like Lincoln's early experiences affected him. Okay.
Tracy, can I ask you a quick question?
Yes, go right ahead.
Sorry, you don't take a breath very often.
I learned that at the Washington Monument. I circular breathe.
Question, was Lincoln kicked in the head by a horse at one of your farms?
I know this story. I think that story originates in Indiana. There is a story of a horse kicking Lincoln in the head, but I think that comes from the Spencer County farm, which is a Boyhood Home Memorial up in Indiana, which is also a National Park Service site. So shout out to them. But yeah, I know that story that y'all are thinking of, and that happened when he was not in Kentucky. So.
And we also had a question about the Mordecai House that you showed us. Where is that located?
Yes. That is located in Springfield, Kentucky, and that is a Kentucky state park. So if you go to the Kentucky State Park website, you can bring up the Springfield Mordecai House. There's also, they also have the cabin where supposedly Thomas and Nancy got married at that site as well. So, yeah.
Okay, carry on.
Questions? Okay, I'll try to take a break or breathe every now and then. Okay, so I wanted to show kind of the path that Lincoln took. When Lincoln was seven and a half-ish, the same thing unfortunately happened to the Lincoln family as it did at the Sinking Spring Farm. Basically, more than one person decided to claim the land that they were living on. And at this point, Thomas threw up his hands and said, I'm done. We're getting out of here. So he packed up his family and they left Kentucky and they moved across the river into Indiana. It's important to note that Indiana, their land surveys were backed by the federal government in those days. Meaning if you went in and paid for money for a farm, that meant that farm was yours and the federal government backed that survey. So you had that land. Unlike Kentucky. So they moved to Spencer County. Again, the National Memorial is there for the Boyhood Home. And then eventually they would move on into Illinois, Decatur, New Salem, and eventually Lincoln would live in Springfield. This is where he would operate his law practice. This is also where he would own his only home that he had during his life. And that is actually a national park site as well, the Lincoln home in Springfield. If you go there, it's lovely. You can also go, that is also where he was brought back after the assassination and his death, where he's buried. So you can still go to the cemetery today and see where Lincoln and Mary and some of the boys are buried there as well. So that's in Springfield. This is also where him and Mary would have the house, they would live. This is also where they would depart and to go to Washington, D.C. when Lincoln was elected president in 1861. So just a little bit of the movement of the Lincoln family. This is a map showing Kentucky, showing Hodgenville. You can see its proximity to Louisville. There was a rail line that run from Louisville down to Nashville in the early 20th century, and you can see it shown there. It also shows you that we are 480 miles to Washington, D.C. So just kind of where our park is situated. Now, moving forward in time, of course, we know Lincoln became president, of course, during a very dark time in our history. during the war, the Civil War, and then, of course, his subsequent assassination, death, and burial. After his death, there was a movement in our country to try to remember him. You know, what was the right way to remember Lincoln? So we know as early as 1865, there was some individuals sent from Washington, D.C. to Kentucky to look around Sinking Spring Farm to see if there was anything left of that cabin of the Lincoln's time in Kentucky. And there is a newspaper report in the Washington newspaper that as early as 1865, when these folks came from DC, tried to find the cabin, they said they couldn't even find foundation stones of where the old cabin sat. So unfortunately, by 1865, all the early vestiges of the Lincoln family cabin were wiped away. So people often, and kids often ask me, well, how do we know where the Lincoln farm, you know, the cabin stood? And I said, we don't know 100% for sure where it actually stood. We just know what Lincoln said. I was born on the rise on the hill above Sinking Spring Farm, or Sinking Spring. So that is why the memorial building stands on that hill and stands on that rise. So in the early 20th century, there were some individuals that banded together because the Lincoln farm, or the area that was Sinking Spring Farm, came up for sale, again, 1905. So they decided to band together, and individuals from the Collier magazine were movers and shakers behind this early effort to try to buy the farm and raise money to create a national monument to Lincoln. So they went to this auction. Fortunately, they got the land. So they said, okay, now that we have the land, we need a cabin. So they asked around some local folks here in LaRue County. And this is what the early farm would have looked like in 1905. It was still being farmed in those days. Had kind of a 2-lane dirt road coming in and out. But they found a local cabin, and that many people said, well, we think this might be the one that the Lincoln family lived in. We don't know for sure, but it's the right time period. So the Collier's magazine decided to organize a tour, basically, and they took this cabin around the country on tour, and charged people basically to get in and see it, and pay to see where young Abraham was reared, so they could raise money for the National Memorial. So an early group kind of out of this organization called the Lincoln Farm Association was formed, and they're the ones that decided to say, we're going to put out information and say we're collecting funds to raise an astronomical fee at the time, but to raise funds to build this first national monument. And everybody that gave funds would become an honorary member of the Lincoln Farm Association. So this is the cabin once they got it to Sinking Spring Farm. Again, a typical frontier cabin, 16 by 20 feet, 1 door, 1 window, 1 chimney, all wood, dirt floor. This is the cabin that we still have in our memorial building today. And these ladies were the ladies who worked with the Lincoln Farm Association. They actually had their headquarters in New York City. So a call went out, like I said, school students to millionaires to people overseas decided to give funds to the Lincoln Farm Association for this memorial. I often say our memorial is a memorial of the people, by the people, and for the people, because there were no federal funds set aside to construct this memorial. All the ladies that you see working here are working on a stack of scrolls. It looks like they're rolled up pieces of paper. And what they're doing is filling out these certificates. And you could donate anything from 25 cents up to whatever you wanted to give. But if you donated at least 25 cents, then you got one of these honorary member certificates that made you an honorary member of the Lincoln Farm Association, which I think is pretty cool. And we actually have, to go back, you see these card catalog files to the ladies to the right of the photo. We actually have those card catalogs in our collection. And we have all of the index cards that were created because every scroll they filled out, certificate, they created an index card about the donor, and over 800,000 individuals gave money to build this monument in Kentucky. The Vanderbilts gave money. It kind of reads like a who's who of early 20th century. The Astors gave money, all the way down to, we have cards that say small donation from a simple farmer, meaning we don't know their name. It was just a private individual wanted to give some funds. So this is a really, really interesting account and record that we have of that time. And we actually have people that lived as far away as in our country, in Hawaii, that gave funds. And there are people that are Americans living overseas at the time that heard about this and gave funds to this cause as well. So we literally have donations from individuals from around the world. So getting back to our 5 presidents and a first lady here. When enough funds were raised, they said, well, we want to have a ceremony. We want to lay the cornerstone of this first national monument to Lincoln. So they invited President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt at the time, to come and lay this cornerstone. He liked doing these apparently, because we have, I was talking to the folks up at the Teddy Roosevelt birthplace, they have a whole drawer of these ceremonial trowels that Teddy used to lay these cornerstones. And they've actually loaned us the silver trowel that he used that we have on display now in our visitor center for this occasion, a very auspicious, grand occasion. So you see in this photograph, Teddy coming up the hill that would become where the stairs are today. Crowning the hill was just a tent with the cabin and a flagpole, very rustic flagpole, but a flagpole. And then they also dedicated the cornerstone. And if you come to the Lincoln Memorial Building today, you will still see this cornerstone on the front of the Memorial Building down on the right-hand side. And it says February 12th, 1909. It's 100 years to the day that Abraham Lincoln was born. And inside the cornerstone, we found out from newspapers that articles were written in the day, they put a time capsule inside the cornerstone. And we think that's what's going on in this photo, because if you see the gentleman kind of standing off to Teddy Roosevelt's left, he's looking at a stack of papers that are wrapped with ribbon that we know from the newspaper articles that they put copies of the speeches that were given that day. They also put a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation and a small copy of the American flags. So unfortunately, they built the memorial around the cornerstone and didn't install a little door to get it out. So we'll never see the time capsule, because as I tell visitors, you'd have to tear the memorial building down to get to it, and we really don't want to do that. But it's a neat record that they left in the building for time, that they thought to do that. This is a photograph, and these old photographs that I'm sharing with you all now are all taken from our glass lantern slide collection that we have here at the park. And I like showing these to kids because they're really visual, and the visitors that come are dressed in their Sunday best, as you can see here. The early visitors came in horse and carriage, but you see the ladies milling about with all their dresses. This is right before the grand staircase was constructed. They have the early risers there. And then this one shows a view of the memorial building in construction with kind of the blocks all piled around. So a very different view than what you see when you come to our park today. This is a photograph of what we call Dedication Day. This is in 1911 when President Taft, who's the gentleman in the top hat and the mustache and the overcoat there in the center, came to dedicate the memorial building. So we know there was a very large crowd that was gathered there. There was a tent that was set up, and a lot of people came by train into Hodgenville for this very grand event. Something to note, kind of interest for me at least, remember me talking about people from all over the world gave money. We've done some research on some of the people. 3 individuals that sank on the Titanic in 1912 gave funds for this memorial to be built. One of which is a presidential advisor, Archibald Butts, who's the gentleman in the bottom right corner. of the photograph with kind of like the jaunty military hat. He came with Taft to dedicate the memorial building in Hodgenville. But unfortunately, this was in February of 1911. About a year and 2 months later, he was on the Titanic and he actually sank with the ship. So he perished in the sinking of this. So it's a very kind of interesting yet sad story, but this individual is a very, very interesting man, old Archie Butts. He seemed to be the life of the party. He gave good parties apparently, and everybody wanted an invitation. And he actually, in his early days, was a journalist, and he was a journalist for a Louisville paper, so right up the road. But President Taft was here, and President Taft, it's interesting to note, he dedicated the memorial building in Kentucky, and then in 1922, he was there at the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. So a cool thread to note. This is another photo of Dedication Day. It gives you an idea of the size of the crowd. I tell kids, look at this picture. What do you know about this day? And they're like, well, it looks cold. I said, yep, it's February. Everybody's got their big puffy coats on. I said, what else? Well, it's raining. I said, exactly. I said, as your historian, you have to look for clues in the historical record. And these photos give us wonderful clues about what the people were doing on that day. We would not have known it had been raining that day if we didn't have this photograph. They estimate the crowd of about 3,000 people there for Dedication Day. So something very monumental and very special. Again, another thread I'm trying to draw between our monument and the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. In Hodgenville, in the center of town, there are now 2 statues of Lincoln. One is a man, very reminiscent of the Lincoln Memorial, where he's sitting in a chair. At the opposite end of the square, there's a boy statue of Lincoln now that was dedicated in 2009 for the bicentennial. In the top photo of this slide that you can see here is the adult statue of Lincoln when it was dedicated in 1909. And the bottom right photo shows a photograph of Robert Todd Lincoln and Mary's eldest son. It's interesting to note Robert Todd came to Hodgenville for this dedication of the adult statue of Lincoln, but he didn't travel 3 miles out to the park, or what would become the park, to see the memorial, which is something we always kind of scratch our head about. But in looking at Robert and his history, Robert embraced the fact that his father was president and kind of the grand things that he did for our country. But he really didn't want to talk about the early years, that his father came from very humble beginnings, that he lived in a log cabin, that he started his life as in a frontier family. He kind of shied away from those facts. And again, I know Robert Todd attended the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial there in Washington, D.C. in 1922. Right, Jen? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So again, just trying to find threads that connect our 2 parks together. We have this connection. This is one of our photos from the 50s of the Lincoln Memorial. And it shows a park ranger there kind of on the steps looking very heroically at the memorial building. And to me, it's such a cool photo because it shows how, rangers or people have always been here to tell this story and to remember Lincoln and everything he did, and to remember his humble beginnings. We always say humble, but not poor. They were not a poor family. They lived in a cabin because that's how you lived on the Kentucky frontier. But from these humble beginnings, from these log walls, Lincoln would go on to occupy the greatest office in the land and walk those marble halls of the White House. So it's something very important for us to pause and remember. It's also, you can talk about with kids here, why do we choose to do this? Why do we as humans feel the need to memorialize these individuals? Lincoln, Washington, Jefferson, MLK. I mean, why do we create monuments? Why do we want to remember these individuals, or how do we remember these individuals, and why is that important?
Stacy, I love this picture because I know, but I do a very similar thing with the pictures of Dr. King on the steps at Lincoln because you can see the two park rangers in those pictures. And I always make sure to ask kids, hey, why do you think Ranger Jen likes these pictures so much? And the idea that you have a ranger picture is just really fun too.
Yeah, and I have a few more. I just had to edit myself because you know me, I can talk for days. But yeah, I always put this because it's like I always make the point too, not only of memorialization, but it's like I ask the kids, what do you think my job is in all this? Like, how am I supposed to help people remember? But it's just my job for your time. It's also part of my job to inspire kids and students to love their history and learn from their history and learn about Abraham Lincoln and why he was important so that then they can carry on that memory to their friends and to their family and to their kids into the future. So it's some very important things to think about. John Russell Pope is the architect of the memorial building here in Kentucky. It's interesting, not Lincoln Memorial related, but John Russell Pope was also the architect of the Jefferson Memorial. So again, that's another National Mall connection. He did some other buildings there in Washington, D.C. But a lot of people ask me why the classical kind of Roman temple. A lot of the architects in those days, like John Russell Pope, were trained in Europe. So they were very classically trained. So their buildings drew from that classical training of, Romanesque style architecture, very balanced with columns, very grand, set up on rises, just like we can see from our Lincoln Memorial in DC. Again, we can see those influences of that Roman architecture, almost like a temple that we're setting aside, not only the memory of these men, but the memory of, who we are as a people. And I think that is important to talk about. So another activity I do with the kids is, how do you want to be remembered? And sometimes I ask them, if you could create your own memorial, what would it look like? So here's where I drag out the pens and the paper and the crayons, and we color and we create things. And I usually have kids laugh at me, and I put this picture here of the pyramids because you're probably like, Stacy, what does this have to do with anything? I always say, I want to be like the kings and the pharaohs of Egypt, and I would want to create a pyramid. That's how I want to be. So I usually draw a pyramid. So you can have kids create their own memorial. Another good way to kind of draw down on this idea about memory and remembrance is creating your own memorial with the kids. And a lot of times this resonates more with older kids, where I've actually taken like a flip chart and given everyone Post-its and said, we're creating our own memorial now. Who do you want to remember? Who do you want to memorialize? And I have each individual write a name on their Post-it, and then one by one they go up and they post their Post-it on the flip chart. And at the end of the program, I have everyone file past. So even though you may not know the individual or have a personal connection with the individual, it's that simple act of remembrance that part of history's job is keeping people's memory alive. And that's what we try to do. So that's a good activity to kind of drill down on remembrance, memorialization, and how do we remember things. And we remember here at our park by having special days set aside. This is during our Now He Belongs to the Ages event that we do in April, where we drape the memorial building in bunting to talk about, his assassination and death. We have programs on Juneteenth where we've had a living historian portray our Frederick Douglass, and he stands at the base of our memorial building and gives a speech and then invites visitors to talk to him. So it's, again, these threads of history that we try to pull on. We remember him by rehabilitating our Knob Creek Visitor Center. This is a new visitor center in our park. If you come and see me, this is what it looks like. And it's sat vacant for 20 years. And now we can take people inside and talk about Lincoln's life and Lincoln's legacy and how it's important to us, not only as a people, but as a country and as basically humans. Why do we remember? why do we remember him for what he is? It's all from those Kentucky roots. Again, give me a boy for the first 7 years of his life, and I'll show you the man. And that is a very important point that no one can display better than Abraham Lincoln himself. So that is my presentation. Thank you very much. This is a nice winter view of our memorial building, the first Lincoln Memorial in our country. How to get that in, Jen? Sorry.
That's great. Thank you, Stacy. I've got a couple questions for you, if you have a minute. Which other presidents and first ladies visited the site?
Thank you. There is Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, Woodrow Wilson, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Eisenhower are the 5 presidents that visited our site. The first lady is Laura Bush in 2009 for the bicentennial. In the middle of an ice storm.
Wow.
Yeah.
Awesome. That's older presidents. You need to work on that a little, maybe.
We haven't had a president come since 1954, so we're due, I think.
I think so. Can you give I've been there, so I think I get it, but what's inside the building is the replica cabin, right?
Sure. Yeah, inside the building is the Symbolic birth cabin. I always tell people, let me go back to a picture because I like pictures and pictures speak to people. It's not a replica, it is a historic cabin. We did do a tree ring study, meaning they came and of the logs and pulled those cores out and counted the rings and found out that this cabin dates from the 1840s. So it's too young of a cabin to be the Lincoln family cabin. But I always tell people, please don't be disappointed because it's still historic. It's still very similar to what and how the Lincoln family would have lived. So if you come see us today, you will see this cabin inside the memorial building. So you'll see that cabin inside this structure here if you come see me today.
Am I wrong? Your steps actually mean something, right? Number of steps?
Yes.
Because we get that question at the Lincoln all the time.
And I remember getting that when I worked there on the mall, and I never connected until I started working here, because we have, as you can see the picture over my shoulder, 56 steps lead up to our memorial building, and 56 is the age of President Lincoln when he was assassinated. So our steps are symbolic. Unlike the steps at the Lincoln Memorial in DC, that number doesn't mean anything, which I often wondered why they didn't make it mean so. But anyway, it wasn't up for me to decide. Anyway, it happens. So if you look at our Lincoln Memorial, let me get back to a kind of closer up picture. The 56 steps mean something. Also, if you look, the square windows that you see the triangular windows in, there are 16 of those triangles in each window. So 16, of course, Lincoln being our 16th president. The memorial building, inside the cabin, there is a stanchions and a bronze chain that surrounds the cabin. And there are 16 stanchions. So again, the number 16 is repeated a lot in our, it's a very, very symbolic with numbers.
And I missed one from earlier on. Someone asked, when will the Boyhood Unit open for the season?
The Boyhood Unit hopefully is going to open on weekends in April and May this year. Then we plan to be open 5 days a week during our summer season, which is Memorial Day to Labor Day. And then after Labor Day, we plan on having it open on weekends only in September and October, and then it will close for the winter season.
And just a comment, and I think it's in regards to the dedication photo, although I may have been a little slow. Someone said that they only see one person of color in the photo. Any comment on that?
And we have talked about that as well. We know that there were members of the community that were individuals of color, African Americans that lived here locally. We do have photographs showing some of the ladies in their fancy dresses around the adult statue of Lincoln, but unfortunately none so much here at the birthplace. And I think the individual kind of is right here in the foreground. And we've actually talked about that amongst ourselves. And it's like, why, why? I don't, and I don't have a good answer for that, unfortunately. I know that there were individuals around, and there wasn't like a rule that said people can't come. And interesting enough, there was a gentleman in attendance at dedication day that was a former enslaved individual of Jeff Davis that read a speech and read the copy of the Emancipation Proclamation that they put in the Cornerstone.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Do you know where in Kentucky Mary Todd's family lived? I know I've been to that house. It's one of the L cities, isn't it?
Yeah, it's Lexington. It's Lexington, and Lexington is not that far away. I mean, by car. So from Hodgenville to Lexington, probably looking at an hour and 20-minute drive. But it's interesting to see how different they're just, that sort of a distance, how different her upbringing was, where she lived in a brick home and went to finishing school and had very nice furnishings, compared to, Lincoln, who lived in a wood cabin, and they farmed, and it's interesting to see. But yeah, it was Lexington, and you could still go see her house today. It's the Mary Todd.
I've been there.
Yeah, it's a neat tour.
Yeah. Well, we've gotten tons of great comments. Everybody loved it. And
Cool.
Thank you so much for being with us today, for being in our series. And
Sure.
we really appreciate everybody who has participated and joined in with us. Thank you all for your comments and questions. Before we sign off, I just want to give a plug for next time. We have coming up, where are we? March. We're going to have the third Wednesday, third Wednesday, 5 o'clock Eastern. I don't know, she didn't really give me a title, but I always called it Geo Story. This is Ranger Sonia. It's like pulling back all the folks who used to work on the mall. She's out west right now, but she is coming to join us in the March session. And she is going to talk about, she's so funny. She's a geologist. This session digs deep into the geologic stories represented by the Lincoln Memorial. So we've done a lot of history, and I think she will too, but she's going to tie it into the geology. The geologic overview of the Washington, D.C. area lays the foundation for finding how geology influences the scenery, development, and history of this area. So please, if you're able to join us again, we will send out a announcement about that. Stacy, someone just said, I love all the classroom activity ideas. So that was a hit. Thank you all so much. And yes, Absolutely. Join us in March for our next session on geology at the Lincoln Memorial. And all of our sessions are being recorded, and they will be on the Trust for the National Mall's educations page. And I think they're also on our Lincoln, nps.gov/Lincoln 100 anniversary page as well. So thank you all so much for your support. Thank you to the Trust. Thank you, Stacy. Great to see you, and wonderful program.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good to see you. Thank you all.